Morning, Lindsay. Can you hear us? Morning, Lindsay. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oh, well, good morning, everyone. We'll resume the hearing 30.9 rezoning requests under the Malvern part of the Selwyn district. And just before we hear from our first submitter this morning from the 42A team, I understand you're going to talk to us about spatial planning and any other matters you want to draw to our attention at this stage.
Well, just I guess very briefly, council are undergoing a spatial planning work under the Local Government Act. That involves Selwyn Futures spatial plan intended to cover the entire district. And out of that, there'll be progressively going to a finer grain, looking at areas, so the Malvern area, the Ellesmere area, and then beyond that, looking at some townships such as Darfield, Wollaston, Lincoln. Yeah, that's essentially what we're doing.
Just for those present, that arose from a question from the panel yesterday. What's the rough timing of that, do you know, before some results might see the light of day?
I think the Selwyn spatial plan is going to be finalised over the next 6 months to 12 months. The area plans and township plans will probably go over the next 2 or 3 years, be a bit of an ongoing bit of work. The Selwyn work will tie into the Greater Christchurch spatial plan.
All right, thank you very much for that. So our first submitter this morning is Mr. Tony Edney, who is going to be appearing on Zoom, I think. Oh, you're here in person? Oh, okay. Come on up. Yeah, just take a seat and have a seat. And thanks very much for the pre-circulated material. You don't need to reread that out to us because we've read it, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight key points for us.
Okay. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ngā mihi o te ata, ko Tony Edney aho. So, yeah, I've only got 15 minutes and what I'd like to do is just, you've just told me that you've all read the submissions, including the memo from, I think, John. Yeah. And then my response to that. Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
Mr. Edney, you don't need to stand unless you really like standing. You're welcome to sit if you wish to.
It won't take me long, so I don't mind standing. What I want to do is just summarize my key points, and I'm going to introduce 2 new items. The first new item is that you see I'm appearing alone. I don't have a retinue of paid professionals with me, but what I do have is letters of support from about a dozen batch owners up at Bearley Spur supporting my submission. And with consent, I'd like to table that to the chair, please. So summarising my submission, Bearley Spur, it sits in the upper Waimaka area. It's in an outstanding natural landscape. The majority of the land use is open space, it's national park or it's riverbed, and that's all in the Crown Estate under Doc and Lynn's management. There's an adjoining high country station there, Cora Lynn. that also derives income from the landscape. It has a wilderness lodge there where it has tourists staying. So for me, in short, the landscape up there is the star of the show. And in my opinion, the planning rules should recognise that. So the proposed change to rural zone from the Beeley EDA, in my view, will have negative consequences to the landscape amenity up there. And a couple of examples. The rural zone allows up to 5 houses on a parcel. And this is obviously intended to house farm workers on large parcels of land, on large farm units. The average size of a section up at Beeley Spur is 800 square metres. So immediately you've got an anomaly there. It would be quite possible for somebody to build a series of small cabins there and start maybe renting them out or whatever. I think that's really contrary to the intent of what's intended up there at Beeley Spur. And another anomaly there is in the rural zone, you're allowed to have aircraft movements, 4 per day, up to 20 per week. And so we could end up with this situation where a well-heeled batch owner may decide to commute to their batch by helicopter. It's not as absurd as it sounds. They have issues like that in Waiheke Island and around Auckland. So, you know, maybe it's coming to a town near you soon. Rezoning Beeley to rural, in my view, will allow inappropriate land use. It's a zone designed to support primary production. It's not a fit for purpose zone for a residential hamlet. Arthur's Pass, Castle Hill, Lake Coleridge have their own zones. So I don't see why Beeley Spur is excluded from this. And just finally, if, and this is the second new point I wanted to introduce, if the panel is okay with this, what I'm prepared to do is at my own expense, engage a planner to write some rules for this, for this area, because I think it's really important that we have some bespoke rules for Beeley Spur. And that's my submission.
Thank you very much for that. I'll see if we have any questions, Rowan.
No, I don't have any questions, but your information was really clear and very much to the point. Thank you.
Okay. And Malcolm?
No questions. No questions, but thank you for your information and what you delivered to us this morning.
All right. Nunzi. Oh, we have one commissioner on Zoom, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm on Zoom and can't be there today, unfortunately. Yeah, just really one question, just getting to the nub of the issue here in terms of the planning framework. The Section 42A author has recommended that there be some amendments to the provisions to make some recognition of Beeley Spur and insert bespoke rule requirements that limit the building structure size to 40 square metres, which I understand is very much what's in the ODP at the moment. What is the particular problem with transferring that across? There is some recognition on what the officer is recommending.
So in my submission, I wrote that 40 square metres is actually too small. If you have a batch, the typical typology is kind of like 1 bedroom and a bunk room, plus by the time you have your living, dining, etc., you know, you're kind of looking at 60 square metres for a batch. 40, what 40 will do will encourage people to build other batches on the site. So what I'm suggesting is that we have a 60 square metre main batch, and then a 15 square metre limit for any ancillary sleep outs, garages or workshops that anybody might want to use. To me, that will actually maintain the character and amenity of the zone. And also, you can do overlays and you can put bespoke things on a rural zone, but it's a rural zone and it's designed for primary production. This is not a primary production location. It's a group of about 30 batches.
Yeah, okay. And so the average batch size is around what, 40, 50 square meters? Considering a 3-bedroom house, average 3-bedroom house is about 90 to 100.
Well, that's in the old days. A state house in the 50s was 90 square meters for a 3-bedroom.
A 3-bedroom state house, 90 to 100 square meters is generally what's referred to.
Yes. So a 60 square meter batches, in my view, is about right for there. And that's about the typical as-built batches up there.
Yeah. And in terms of the letters of support, you've got a dozen or so of the other landowners. So is that a good percentage? Is it more than 50%, or have you been with everybody else?
Well, there's 30 batches up there, and there's about a dozen letters of support. So that's 30%. I think that's actually not bad, considering that I wasn't able to get in contact with some of the batch owners who are kind of what you might describe as absentee owners. They use their batches once or twice a year, some of them. And I think the other thing is that the reason that I'm the only person submitting is with respect to the planning process. For a lot of people, it's actually impenetrable. It's complex, and people just throw their hands up because it's too hard. And once I alerted them to the fact that, this rule change is going to create some issues, then obviously they were supportive. But for your average person, coming and doing this is just not on the program. Yeah.
So in the operative district plan and in what Mr. Truen is suggesting, there's a rollover of that. There is a recognition in those provisions that this is not your average rural piece of land. There is some recognition in that. So my understanding is that you basically want a little bit more leeway,
yes,
in terms of what you can do as of right prior to going for resource consent. So
yes,
if there was a resource consent, it would be in the knowledge that you can get 40 square meters as of right, and you basically wanting to build something a little bit bigger, but you would need to go through a process to do that. Is that your problem? Is the transactional costs involved in building something a bit bigger than 40 square meters?
Yeah, I think 60 square meters is really what you should be allowed for your primary structure. But also what I want to do is, limit any ancillary structures to 15 square meters. At the moment, you can build as of right to 30 square meters. So if you've got a 40 square meter batch, and then you go and build a 30 square meter ancillary building like a sleep out, you're going to end up with a kind of a mishmash. So I think in terms of saying, okay, this is the batch structure, this is the sleep out, you need a distinct separation in size. So I think the 60-15 ratio is actually quite good. Otherwise, you might end up with a 40-30. So they'll be just too similar. So you end up with multiple dwellings on one site.
So your suggestion is the accessory building is definitely accessory, it's ancillary. In terms of scale, it's a lot more smaller than the proposed building. So
yes, so what I'm really asking for is a more nuanced approach to what's proposed at the moment, because I think it's just a bit too broad brush, and that landscape up there is really, it's beautiful, it's amazing, and I think inappropriate structures up there are, just going to degrade from the actual experience that people have from going up there. And something else to think about as well is that, within the next 50 years, it's almost certain that we're going to have a massive earthquake up there that will destroy everything. So I think encouraging any kind of major builds up there is not a great idea.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Edney, from what you've told us this morning, I'm getting the impression that your main concern is relates to your request for a 60-metre squared primary building and a 15 square metre ancillary building. Is that your primary focus you'd like us to take away and think about?
Yes, there's some other amenity issues like, colours,
Sure.
those sorts of things. But yes, that's the
main-
nub of it.
The number of it. And in your written submission, you raised a couple more issues. You're seeking no fences.
Yes,
How many of the properties that exist there now would have a boundary fence on the road?
there's a couple of batches there which have side fences.
Side fences, yeah.
Yeah.
And any boundary fences on the road, to your knowledge? No. Okay.
I just think you put those rules in, that means you're not going to end up with a suburban looking environment,
Sure.
because you just don't know what the next person's going to do. There's a kind of, what's happened there is that there's been a generation who have built batches there in the 50s and 60s. They are now handing their batches down, and some of them are now getting sold. I'm what's called a new person. I've only been there 10 years. You can see if somebody comes in, they've got their own ideas of what their little piece of paradise would be, which might include a nicely fenced batch area, which
Sure.
Would be totally inappropriate for that area.
No, I understand. Okay, well, look, that's good. That's what I wanted to clarify with you, and thank you for your offer to engage a planning consultant at your own cost. You don't need to do that. What we will do, we'll consider and discuss the issues you've raised with us, and if we think that additional provisions are required, we've got a whole bunch of council staff who can do that wording and for us, so you don't need to worry about spending your own money on that. But you've made your points very clear to us, and we'll give them good consideration.
All right, thank you, I appreciate
Thank you.
that.
Right, and next submitter, Ascot Park Limited.
Everyone.
Good morning.
Morning. I'm Jamie Robinson here with Roger Crozier for Ascot Park Limited. I had circulated a memorandum a couple of weeks ago in relation to the expert evidence that was presented, and had confirmation back from you all that you were comfortable that none of the experts needed to be here, so they're not. So Roger is going to be able to answer any questions you've got about development so far and future plans, but there is just one point I'd like to cover before we get there. There was an issue that's arisen in the 42A officers memorandum, which was dated the 18th of April, and in that at paragraph 5.14 it was noted that there's no connection with the neighbouring development. There are existing plans that Roger has got copies of here if you would like to see them, but existing plans that are authorised, they were part of the consent sitting with council, that show both a road connection and also a separate walkway into that development. So no issue with, from our perspective, in terms of having that formalised through the development area plan. I think it's DEV-DA1, but I would ask that perhaps we see a copy of that, or it's ensured that the connection on that plan aligns with the approved resource consent plan. Aside from that, I didn't have anything additional that I wanted to raise. If you've got any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Thanks very much for that, Raymond.
Are you Miss Gazelle?
No, Miss Robinson, so legal counsel, we had approval that none of that, so our planning expert isn't here. I can attempt
You might
to
be able
answer, or we can
yeah.
get a written response if that's
I just
helpful.
wanted to ask a question about the existing waterways, and I understand that that's a council responsibility. Does the landowners have any responsibilities to that waterways?
Okay, do you wanna? So Mr. Crozier just told me he doesn't think that the water race is on his land.
Okay.
My understanding of water races in Selwyn generally is that there's a requirement for access to be available, but it's the council that does the work.
Right.
So there's sort of a, an area that's identified either side that needs to be kept clear.
So was it suggested that the water race might be a buffer between both parcels of blocks of land?
Right.
Murray might know.
Or
Murray might know more about that.
But the water race is presently being piped as the land's being developed, and it will be from pipe.
so it's not going to be used as a buffer, part of a buffer.
Um,
I'm probably.
I think it's residential on both sides.
Can I show you that?
Yes. Is that all wrong?
This is a subdivision here.
Yeah, yeah.
This is Kersey Park. This is Murray, who's here today as well. This is his land here.
Yes.
The water race is along there,
Yes.
along this, and Murray is currently piping it all.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. I just wanted that clarified. Thank you. No.
Malcolm?
No question.
Lindsay?
No questions, thank you.
No questions of clarification from me either, but in terms of Mr. Trewin's recommendation to amend DVA-DA1 to align with, and you're saying you're fine with that because it would align with the resource consent that's currently in place. So Mr. Trewin, if just assume that we're minded to accept your recommendation in that regard, would the council then undertake that amendment to that DVA-DA1 and then just check with the submitter that it aligns with where they think it should go, the road?
Yeah, we can do, or would the submitter like to do it?
Who's best placed to do
Just
it?
because they proposed a different development plan. I think in your submission, you amended your development area plan. 'Cause
Possibly.
you removed the industrial area and changed moved the setback.
Sure. So that's the crux of this, the submission is the removal of the industrial zone or the rezoning of the industrial to residential. The access way is actually right down the other end of the subdivision, but we can do that. It probably isn't going to look as pretty as if the council did it, but I'm happy to provide an updated plan, and maybe someone at council can make it look like it's supposed to look.
Yeah, because there was a plan I was just looking at you, sorry, this submission, there was a plan that was provided by Calibre, which amended the area that was proposed to be industrial to residential and then moved the setback to the existing industrial zone. So I just assume that you produced that, but council can do it as well, but whatever's easiest, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're talking at cross purposes. So that's at this end. I know that I shouldn't be showing, sorry,
right.
to Commissioner Dash, but the proposed accessway is down
It's to the
that
east,
end. Yeah. So look, I'm happy to do it. We'll send a wee best to coordinate through the hearings coordinator for that. And if there's any issues, you can let me know in a minute.
I think you can liaise directly with Mr. Trewin on this matter, and I don't mind. I was simply wondering logistically who had the best software and who already had a picture that could be easily altered. So there's I don't really mind who does it, just wanted to make it as easy as possible. So why don't you liaise about that, and whoever's best to draw the revised diagram, undertake it, and then that can come through to us.
You are right though, Calvert did do exactly what you said,
The plan.
did do it with the roading going right through it, then being residential.
Okay. Thanks, we'll sort it out, Chair.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very
Thank you.
much. No
Nothing
further
else?
questions? No, that's great.
Thank you.
So the next submitter on our list is Murray Boys and Kersey Park Limited, joint submission. Or combined presentation rather.
Good morning. My name is Samantha Gardner and I'm here on behalf of both Mr. Boys and Kersey Park Limited this morning. Here with me today is Mr. Boys and Mr. Carr. As you've read the written legal submissions, I propose to take you through the key points of the submitter's rezoning sought through their submission and address any questions that you might have. Today, we hear about a site that's approximately 30 hectares in size on the corner of State Highway 73 and Craik Road in Darfield. The site has already been through a private plan change process, Plan Change 61 to the operative Selwyn District Plan, that enabled business zoning and living one zoning on the site. This zoning became fully operative in 2021 and subdivision consent has since been granted for the eastern corner of the site. Essentially, the submitters seek to transfer the zoning enabled under PC 61 into the proposed Selwyn District Plan and to increase the extent of the residential zoning provided by approximately 5 hectares with a commensurate reduction in the industrial zoning provided on the site. For clarity, this means the submitters are still seeking to provide approximately 12 hectares of industrial land across the site. Evidence has been filed in support of the rezoning, covering a range of matters, infrastructure, traffic, economics and planning that demonstrates the zoning is the most appropriate for the site. The reporting officer has recommended the submitter's submission is accepted, in part enabling the rezoning requested. Mr. Carr filed rebuttal evidence addressing the reporting officer's query about the impact of the Kayanga Ora submission across the site. My understanding is that seeks to upzone all low density residential zoning in the Darfield Township to general residential zoning, and that could equate to approximately additional 15 to 20 sites across the submitter site. Mr. Carr concluded that that would have no discernible effect on the state highway or the district roading network, and the council's transport expert, Mr. Collins, has agreed with those findings in the recent memorandum. Mr. Jacob also filed rebuttal evidence addressing a number of points in relation to economics, but essentially, despite differing views on demand, both economic experts agree the additional residential land can be appropriately provided, and the council expert, Mr. Foy, notes that there will be little economic downside in the requested zone change. Importantly, in relation to the supply of industrial land in Darfield, Mr. Foy has confirmed that Mr. Baird's analysis, which showed a shortfall of industrial land, did not include the industrial land rezoned through PC 61. So if the panel accepts Mr. Boy's submission for the rezoning, once the industrial land sought to be provided on the site, approximately 12 hectares occur as included in these calculations, combined with the additional industrial land available in Darfield, which I understand is approximately 4 hectares if the Ascot Park submission is also accepted, there would be approximately 16 hectares of industrial land that could meet the expected medium-term demand of 12 hectares. So there'd be no shortfall. An additional matter that Ms. Robinson has also raised was identified by Mr. Collins about the proposed development area that lies across Ascot Park, that development area 1. It was raised in the reporting officer's memorandum in the context of Mr. Boy's submission. So we briefly wanted to address that to say that the development area is not over the submitter's site, and on that basis they take a neutral position on the connections provided. We do note that on the subdivision plan included in the reporting officer's memorandum, there's provision there for a roading connection and a pedestrian connection. The pedestrian connection does not connect into the Kersey Park site. That's 2 sites along from Kersey Park. One final point I would like to record is in relation to the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land. The reporting officer has considered that this does not apply and the submitters support this conclusion. In my submission, this position is correct because the interim definition of highly productive land applies to land that at the commencement date of the NPS is already zoned general rural or rural production and contains those land use classifications 1, 2 or 3. At the commencement date of the HPL, which 17th of October last year, the site was already zoned Living 1 and Business under the operative Selwyn District Plan. Neither of these zones are equivalent to the general rural or the rural production zones under the national planning standards, and accordingly it is my submission that the NPS HPL does not apply to the site. Accordingly, there are no outstanding matters of concern or material reasons not to accept the submitter's rezoning. And in my submission, the rezoning sought is the most appropriate zoning for the site. It is a logical extension of residential zoned land in the Darfield Township. It's supported by infrastructure and services, and it recognises the current use of the site today. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'll see if we have any questions in general, and then either yourself or Mr. Carr can address those. Raymond, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you.
No, in view of the 42A report, I have no questions.
And Lindsay?
Yeah, it's more a question of clarification for me in terms of the boundaries that have been allocated between the industrial land and the residential land. There's big curves on them. Can you explain the reason why there is a curve on those? Traditionally they would be straight lines and intersect with boundaries. What's the reasons for the curve?
My understanding is it's to do with a setback from the industrial land and the odour. Is it noise or odour?
There's a poultry farm across the road, across the state highway, which has a circular setback. That's
okay.
dictated.
So the circular boundary of that industrial land correlates with that setback. So that's why you've got that irregular shape that you wouldn't generally see.
All right, thank you. I don't have any questions. It looks like this has been well traversed, and I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just one matter I wanted to ask about, and there's been a lot of documentation, so this may have been addressed already, but I'll ask the question anyway. Does the ODP narrative need to be amended to require auxiliary turning lanes onto State Highway 73 on issuance of title for the 26th allotment, which I think was an issue raised by our reporting officer at some stage?
We might have to tag team on this one.
Or maybe just before
the outcome that you...
So, Mr. Treven, was that a recommendation that came through from you, or have I got that wrong?
Apologies, Chair, just having a look. It might have been from Mr. Collins.
Yeah, I think I picked it up from either yourself or from Mr. Collins' documentation. So maybe while Mr. Carr thinks about that, if you could have a search through for us. So Mr. Carr, back to you.
So just by way of background, the matter of the upgrade of the intersection was traversed at some length through PC 61.
Right.
And so within the provisions of the plan change, there is certainly a requirement to upgrade the intersection at certain trigger points. Subsequent to that, there has been discussion with Waka Kotahi about those trigger points, and I understand those trigger points have increased. So there should be some provision for within the zoning for the upgrade, but how that will be done and quite where we've landed at the current time with those numbers, I don't know, because I've not been involved with all of that process. But there, as a sort of high level answer, yes, there should be some provision for it but I'm just not sure where the numbers sit at the moment in terms of the agreement with Wakakotai.
Okay. Well, in light of that, Ms. Gardner, are you happy if Mr. Carr just looks into that a bit further, and then you just come back to us via our hearing secretary, just whether or not the ODP narrative needs to be amended to address that issue?
Yes, sure. That's absolutely fine. I note that in the ODP narrative, there is a clause that provides for that with the figure for the residential lot to be filled in. So I'll liaise with Mr. Carr and come back to you on that point.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. That's the only matter I wanted to clarify, but otherwise, thanks very much for coming in this morning. Next matter, Cameron. Morning.
Thanks for having us here today. Mr. Cameron unfortunately cannot make it just due to a contract he's undertaking. He's a civil contractor. However, he has asked me to just sort of make a couple of comments on his behalf, just in relation to the land. So Alistair has owned the land since 1996. It's been a long-term sort of property for him. It's currently grazed. He believes that it's well located and close to the town centre, close to the high school, and would be a suitable location for families. So my name's Fred Coughlin. I'm a senior planner at Davis Ogilvy and Partners, and I prepared the submission and rebuttal evidence for planning on behalf of Mr. Alistair Cameron. I understand that the submission and evidence are taken as read, so I'll keep this brief. The land, which is owned by the submitter, Mr. Cameron, is located between Bangor and Critters Road, Darfield, and has an area of 3.64 hectares. The property is adjacent to Darfield High School and located on the northwestern periphery of the township, approximately 310 metres from the nearest commercial zone and 720 metres from the physical town centre. This was illustrated by attachment A to my rebuttal evidence. The submitter proposes rezoning of the subject property from LLRZ to LRZ. As per the submission, this will enable more intensive residential development within the existing residential zone area within which it is located. The submitter contends that the rezoning is appropriate for the following reasons. It will achieve an appropriate, compact and consolidated urban form. It will not result in adverse reverse sensitivity effects. It promotes the efficient use of infrastructure. It will give effect to the Malvern area plan. It will support the economic self-sufficiency of the Darfield town centre. The land can be safely accessed from the state highway network. More detailed site investigations can resolve detailed design in relation to infrastructure and ground conditions and the likes at the time of subdivision consent. There is little economic downside to enabling additional residential capacity in Darfield, and it will be consistent with the Selwyn urban growth policies, Canterbury regional policy statement, objectives and policies, and higher order documents, including the national policy statement for urban development in relation to housing, provision of housing choice and walkable proximities, and also in relation to the national policy statement for highly productive land in relation to the fact that it is a rezoning of existing residential land and intensification, which is a peripheral outcome of that. In accordance with the Section 42A report and subsequent memorandum received 18th of April from the recommending officer, Council and submitter are in agreement on most of these points. Importantly, the matter of safe access to the state highway network is now considered to be suitably resolved following the rebuttal evidence provided by Mr. Carr. The key outstanding matter pertains to urban form. This is the focus of the planning response to the Cameron rebuttal evidence in the 18th April memorandum. The recommending officer does not agree that development at the site will form a compact and consolidated urban form. I maintain my position to the contrary on this, and note the following in response to the matters raised. I consider the matter of consistency between the subject submission, Plan Change 61, and the Boys submission is of critical importance. The recommending officer has acknowledged in the 18th of April memorandum that there is potential for inconsistency between these. As illustrated in attachment A, submitted with my rebuttal evidence, the properties share very similar spatial characteristics as they relate to the township, being land that is or is proposed to be rezoned that will remain separated from the existing urban form by an area of lower density residential land. I know that in my view, the subject land is superior in its spatial relationship to the town centre as compared to the PC61 land. Mr. Truan notes in his memorandum that the Boys submission also does not fully achieve the objective of appropriate urban form. He qualifies, though, that the Boys submission is acceptable as through a previous council process, being Plan Change 61, which was also a plan change, the land was already afforded an equivalent LRZ zoning status, so therefore intensification is appropriate. As was noted in my rebuttal evidence, the recommending officer was the same officer who recommended Plan Change 61, making the following conclusion at the time, and I quote, "I consider that this is a more efficient use of land that is already identified for rural use and is adjacent to the existing Darfield Township boundary, resulting in appropriate concentric development." Essentially, the recommending officer relies on the prior implementation of Plan Change 61 as the reason the Boys submission is acceptable in relation to its urban form, but in spite of it. But at the same time has recommended the same urban form as appropriate in the Section 42A report prepared for Plan Change 61, effectively setting the precedent with which he now disagrees. There are clear spatial similarities between the subject submission, Plan Change 61, and the Boys submission. The reason for the recommending officer's inconsistency in recommendation remains unclear. What is clear in my view is that the urban form resulting from the subject rezoning can be considered appropriate and acceptable for the same reasons as Plan Change 61 and ultimately the Boys submission. The memorandum raises an additional matter of reverse sensitivity from the existing Mitchell Brothers sawmill as a potential contributing factor to an inappropriate urban form outcome. The Section 42A report recorded agreement that reverse sensitivity is suitably managed in relation to the actual subject site area due to its separation from the activity which exceeds the 60-metre buffer set out in the DEV DA6 development area in the plan. This is not in contention. I understand the newly raised matter to relate to potential reverse sensitivity effects on the sites located between the subject land and State Highway 73 to the north, and the potential that these will not be developable due to the potential reverse sensitivity from the mill, therefore maintaining a forever separation of the land from the Darfield Township and not allowing ultimate consolidation of development in this area. However, based on the same 60-metre buffer applied through the district plan under DEV DA6, 80% of that intermediary land remains outside of this buffer area. A quantum of 20% of the land within the buffer is unlikely to have the outcome of limiting intensification and incorporation of this intermediary land into the township and ultimately consolidation of the urban form. Additionally, the Malvern area plan provides 4 commercial outcomes at this end of the development area. These could be incorporated within this 20% buffer and is a reasonable outcome. Additionally, further mitigation may be available within this area. Ultimately, the subject land is well located spatially in relation to the Darfield Town Centre. This is identified by the Malvern area plan and its inclusion as a preferred future development area. It is additionally clearly illustrated by the spatial relationship to the township. The rezoning of the subject land will give effect to a compact and consolidated urban form, both in its own right and when considered in relation to potential future growth patterns as established by the Malvern area plan. For the reasons outlined above and in evidence, the rezoning to LRZ is considered appropriate relief as it achieves a compact and consolidated urban form and gives effect to a preferred future development area as identified by the Malvern area plan. It will provide housing opportunities and walking distance to the town centre. Notwithstanding this, the Kāinga Ora submission, which is supported by this Section 42A report, suggests that GRZ zoning is adopted in place of the LRZ zoning. If the panel agrees with the submitter on this, then we would accept the alternate zoning as relief. I appreciate the panel's time on the matter.
Thank you. Now that you were reading from a document, that wasn't your evidence, was it? That's the new document?
Yes.
Yeah, it would have been nice if you'd pre-circulated that so we could follow that as you're reading out. There's a lot of detailed information.
On that note, I only received the on the 18th, so I had to sort of formulate that subsequently, and yeah, apologies for not pre-circulating.
Yep, but can you provide a copy of that written document you were reading from to our hearing secretary? And then
Yes.
we can review that in our own time.
Certainly.
But I'll just see if we have any questions for you, Raymond.
Yeah, yes. So the urban design matters. Is there any urban design evidence that can support your submission?
We've not provided any urban design evidence. I guess we've considered this in a planning sense, and looked at the spatial allocation of the land in terms of the township. There's a small land holding. The design can be resolved at the time of subdivision consent. Possibly, if it would assist the panel in reaching a favourable decision, an outline development plan in terms of DEV DA6, or a modification to the outline development plan of DEV DA6 could be supplied, which might also consider the transport comments in the April 18th memorandum, which suggested a road crossing or pedestrian crossing for traffic safety matters.
Yeah, thank you.
Malcolm?
Yes, I'm looking at the overall planning map who's sitting here in the 42A analysis, and I'm pleased you have conversed the item of the mill next door. The packages of land are quite close, and the reverse sensitivity effects are something that I could see as a major barrier to this going ahead. Are you aware of anybody in the proximity of that existing piece of land who've had issues with the noise and dust from the mill?
I'm not aware of that myself. The land is currently unoccupied,
Right.
It's grazed, so the submitter sort of, I guess, doesn't have that issue currently. The Selwyn district plan sets out a 60-metre buffer under DEV DA6, which is the existing development area, implemented under Plan Change 49. This, I guess, was considered appropriate for Plan Change 49, and has been considered appropriate in the Section 42A report in relation to this particular rezoning. And that's, I guess, what I've relied on in terms of potential reverse sensitivity effects on those intermediate reallotments.
Thank you, Mr. Coghlan. I'm aware of that. I'm just reflecting on some of the evidence that we've heard in the last day to do with reverse sensitivity issues from this very property. So it's the top of my mind at the moment. So thank you very much.
Now, Lindsay?
Thank you, Mr. Coghlan. There's obviously been a little bit of toing and froing between yourself and the 42A officer in written form anyway, and you explained some of your views on Mr. Truan's supplementary evidence he provided for us a few days ago. One key point which you may have covered in, but I'm not entirely sure, is at paragraph 5.8 of Mr. Truan's additional addendum that he sent through. He talks about the whole urban form, and if this property was to be zoned LRZ or GRZ, if the Kaingaroa submission is granted, it would be like a spur on the other side. I think his specific wording is it looks like that this is an indentation into the large lot residential. Do you have any view on that? And I don't know whether you were here, and you can probably wrap it all up in the same answer at the start, where we talked about what council's doing in a spatial planning sense. Because if you look at the planning map, there's a lot going on in this particular part of Darfield, and it would, and in a pure planning sense, you'd really want to look at that whole area comprehensively, considering all the factors that there are in play. So, what's your views on Mr. Truan's opinion
I guess, so the land does give progressively effect to a concentric and sort of comprehensive urban form. Mr. Cameron can only be responsible, I guess, for his own land in the submission. It's not a joint submission. And so to that extent, the adjacent land as you move towards the Darfield town centre is identified already by the Malvern area plan. And I guess it follows that any future spatial plan, is likely to consider that land as
But
appropriate.
it's not in the PDP, and it currently is as being LRZ.
Yes, it's LLRZ currently.
Yeah, well, that's
in the PDP.
right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Go on.
So we suggest that LRZ is appropriate in that location as it provides higher intensity, urban development closer to the Darfield town centre. It's located adjacent to existing LRZ zoning, which is proposed by the PDP. So and concentrically it aligns with this. Mr. Cameron can't be responsible for that land in between his land and the town centre, but given its location, that land ultimately may head down the same pathway.
Yes, so if your relief was granted, you would have a block of land, which is LRZ or GRZ, as the case may be, which is surrounded on three sides by LLRZ. I'm just thinking in terms of the whole urban form, concentric areas, whether a one-off response to your client's aspirations is appropriate at this particular point in time, when there is other factors which would need to be looked at potentially in the future.
Without, I guess, the council having given effect to what is the Malvern area plan in the current district plan, or the proposed district plan, it is up to Mr. Cameron to progress this in terms of providing for a concentric and concentric urban form. We think it's appropriate, and the intermediary land can be, or maybe rezoned in the future. But I guess to give effect to concentric urban form, you've got to give effect to it, and this is the first step of that, I guess, in relation to this area of Darfield.
Yeah, it might be slightly more straightforward for your client if it was the other land to the east rather than this particular property. I can see where you're coming from, but certainly in terms of the spatial planning exercise, that's going to take 6 to 12 months, and then various other things in terms of townships will potentially be in the next 2 or 3 years was my understanding. So is there a view that this is premature? You should wait for the bigger picture to be looked at rather than look at a potential spot zoning on the basis of the PDP submission at this time? What's your response to that?
I don't think there is any harm in it. Retaining it as LLRZ may even result in an adverse outcome in relation to any future intensification through fragmentation of that land into 5,000 square metre sections. It has been clearly demonstrated as well located, and I think that's sort of accepted, in lieu of the urban form. It is well located. It is appropriate. It is an appropriate step to take at this point, I believe.
Okay, thank you for that.
No, I don't have any questions for Mr. Carr. I think his response has addressed the transport issues, so thank you for that. But I guess I share Commissioner Daish's concern regarding this particular submission being a little bit, if we were to grant it, resulting in a bit of an odd outcome where you'd have a LRZ or a GRZ basically surrounded on three sides by large lot LLRZ. I know it's not part of the DEV DA6, that's across the road. So not really a question, but just letting you know that I share Commissioner Daish's concerns in terms of what sort of outcome this might achieve, should we be minded to grant the relief that's being sought. So not a question, but I just didn't want you to go away not knowing how I saw the submission.
Fair enough.
All right, but thank you very much for coming in this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Now, our next submitter is Beeley Developments, who went scheduled until 10:45. Were they coming in person or on Zoom here, that do you know? In person. So we'll adjourn now until 10:45 or an earlier time if Beeley Developments come in before then. Thank you. Lindsay, Lindsay, just checking you can hear us.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Excellent. So, Mr. Cleary, you ready to go?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, we'll reconvene the hearing, and at this stage, we're hearing from Beeley Developments Limited. So you've appeared before us several times before, so you know the
Oh, well,
drill.
I'm not sure it's several, but a number of times anyway.
Yeah.
But just, I mean, obviously, I haven't filed any written legal submissions, and for the simple reason I didn't think there were any particular matters of legal moment. But if you have any questions of a legal nature, please feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to respond. But otherwise, you will have seen, and I think Mr. Twin has circulated a summary statement prepared by Ms. Comfort, and we'll get to that later. But essentially, that summary statement firstly includes an updated outline development plan to reflect the agreement on a number of matters of detail between herself and Mr. Truan. And secondly, the summary statement responds to a number of matters raised in Mr. Collins's, I would say, supplementary statement, and more specifically, Mr. Collins's reference to a number of policy provisions in the proposed district plan. And Mr. Collins hasn't actually prepared any analysis to support his conclusion on those provisions, and that's basically why I asked Ms. Comfort to undertake that task. And I just invite the panel to pay particular attention to the wording of those provisions, and note that they are not of a prescriptive or directive nature. And in such circumstances, I would say the normal starting point and probably the finishing point, that is, it would be difficult to reach a conclusion that any development would be contrary to those policies. And I'm particularly referring to the use of the words like encourage or encouraging. And that's in the context of multimodal forms of transport, which are, of course, the panel will note that the outline development plan does incorporate walking and cycling routes. Okay, but we have, first of all, if you have any questions for the traffic expert, Mr. Verte, I understand is how it's pronounced. So that's an Irish person trying to pronounce a French surname. So it might not be accurate. But if you have any questions for him, Mr. Verte hasn't prepared a summary. So he's just here to respond to questions.
Thank you. I'm wondering if maybe if Ms. Comfort would to read out her comments that were just received by way of the email, because they do address some traffic issues. Maybe if you read those out, and then at the end of that, we'll see if we have questions either for you or for Mr. Verte. Would that be all right?
Yeah, in your hands. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll introduce myself. I'm Julie Comfort. I'm from Davey Lovell Smith. I'm a planner. This is my first time before you. So and on the very last day. So I wasn't actually anticipating making this statement until we received the memorandum, because as far as I understood, things were 99% there. So I thought there was just some additional comments that just needed to be made, and I thought they were appropriate. I note that in the memorandum, Mr. Truan agrees with the revised appears to agree with the revised ODP and supporting narrative that had been attached to my rebuttal, and that the matters raised within my rebuttal addressed those that were within his paragraph 15.21 of his section 42A report. Mr. Collins, in his memorandum of the 11th of April, says that he still considers a shared path as appropriate along the Hoskins Road frontage on the basis of a council intent to have a cycle link between Darfield and West Melton. I've had a look at the walking and cycling action plan that Mr. Collins referred to, and acknowledged that that link is identified as something that the council wishes to have occur. I've also reviewed the consultation information from the 2021 long-term plan,
and specifically the list of roading projects for both the 10-year and the beyond 10-year that were provided at that time. And that shows that they currently place the connection between Darfield and Kirwee as occurring in the 2032 and 33 year. And the Kirwee to West Melton is out in the 2047 and 48 year. And they also, it tends to indicate a preferred route as being adjoining the state highway and railway line, which is on the south side of the Beeley Developments land. Hoskins Road is on the north side. I acknowledge that these implementation dates are quite fluid. They can be brought forward as there is demand, and that the ultimate route is still not finalised. So given this direction from the council, while it's considered, we still don't consider a shared path along the Hoskins frontage is ultimately going to be necessary. We've added wording to the narrative to require at the time of subdivision consideration of the provision of a wider footpath from the 1.5 that the ODP requires to 2.5, taking into account what the council's preferred route is at that time and what its timing is. If the preferred route is still along the railway line, the council staff at the time might not require the shared path to occur, but I believe it's a decision that should be made at that point. And we've provided you with that updated ODP and narrative. So just to point to the narrative, just to show you what had changed from previously in my rebuttal, it was just the last sentence of the third paragraph under access and transport. Mr. Collins also still considers that a delay in rezoning is necessary on the basis that capacity in other towns is able to be provided on the basis that those towns have better accessibility to public transport. He then raises for the first time that the matter of rezoning being contrary to Transportation Objective 01 and 3 transport policies, P2.2, 5.1 and 6.2. The case law has suggested that for an activity to be contrary to an objective and policy, it has to be repugnant to it or to turn its back on it. I'm sure Mr. Cleary can clarify that for you if need be. I have listed there for you those particular objectives and policies. I won't read them out. In looking at them, I disagree with Mr. Collins and I consider that the intensification of the Beeley land can be supported by the identified objectives and policies. And I'm also of the view that the ultimate development can support the outcomes that they seek. In terms of the language used in them, I also do not regard them to be as highly directive or prescriptive as Mr. Cleary pointed out, that's talking about encouraging things to occur. The Beeley site is located on the state highway, which is a safe, efficient and convenient land transport corridor. And the development will be integrated with that corridor through a direct connection to that road. In addition, the transport network will include direct and convenient access to the existing town of Kirwee, including access to public transport. The future subdivision will be able to provide walking and cycling routes that connect with the existing town and facilities, and will therefore enable a range of travel modes as sought by Transport Policy 2.2 and as encouraged by the other provisions referred to by Mr. Collins. Public transport is available in Kirwee, it's just not at the frequency as that provided to the other towns. That frequency is, however, driven by both demand and the cost of providing the service. I discussed in my rebuttal evidence the current demand has resulted in the Metro increasing the capacity of the bus provided on that route, and that started about the 20th of March, and it's a double-decker bus that now runs along there when it's available, I understand. An intensification of the Beeley land can only help to support this route and encourage its potential expansion. The residential development of the Beeley site is already permitted by both the current and proposed zonings. It is just a matter at which intensity that residential development is to occur that's under consideration. In this regard, I consider the settlement zoning of the site to be a more efficient use of land and services and is generally supported by the objectives and policies of the proposed district plan. I certainly do not read the transport objectives and policies referred to by Mr. Collins as directing that development should not occur in specific townships in preference to other locations.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Just an observation. It may be that Mr. Collins is straight outside his area of expertise. The recommendation from our planning advisor is to accept the submission. So we'll take that into account when we consider the matters you've raised. But I'll see if we have any questions either for you or for Mr. De Virtue.
Yes, I do have one. What were the urban frontage issues with the shared pathway on Hoskins Road?
Yeah, either can answer it.
Can you repeat that again?
What were the urban frontage issues
Um,
to do with the shared pathway on Hoskins Road?
I guess it's not an issue. I guess. Well, I guess the crux is you've got I think it's about 800 meters or so stretch of footpath already from Courtney Road up to the western boundary of the site, which is 1.5 meters wide. So that's a typical footpath. And then we're going to put in a 2.5 meter footpath for the length of our frontage, which is only a short section. And it's going to stand out, and it's not going to bring much continuity or linkage having a long section of 1.5 and then a short section of 2.5.
Right.
It doesn't fit in. So if we knew there was a link, definite cycle strategy, and it was all going to tie into that point, fair enough, I could say, yeah, let's do that. And then council could in a few years' time work on the rest of it and widen that to 2.5. But in my mind, if we don't have a clear strategy of what's happening in the future, and especially if it's being pointed out it's going to be in the south side, then that road doesn't go anywhere. It's a gravel track, literally east of our site.
Yeah.
So I don't mind there being a shared path if there's a point, but if there isn't and there's no clear indication we are going that way, then I don't see the point of just having a short section of 2.5.
Yeah, no, thank you.
And secondly, also I could add, Hoskins Road is a quiet road. It's not a busy road. So in effect, cyclists can use Hoskins Road anywhere and cycle on there pretty easily. So another reason why it's not required at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm.
No questions. Thank you.
Lindsay, any questions?
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple. Ms. Comfort, in your narrative to the Gooey development area, you say that there should be consideration given to the 2.5 metre shared path that we talked about there. In terms of decision making, something like a consideration is not as precise. What do you actually mean by how would you actually implement it? Would you actually say, well, the council's got something in their long-term plan which is it's identified a shared path on Hoskins Road as the preferred method of getting from A to B by those modes. So how would a consideration actually work in practice at decision-making stage at subdivision? It's not mandatory, you just got to consider it.
As I can see your point, take your point on that, and yeah, it probably could be worded better in that regard. I think it's because at this point it's still very much an unknown. So requiring it, if the council's preferred route is somewhere else, as we've said, does seem to be a bit too directive. And from experience, if we have something that is required in an ODP but not required by asset staff, we still have planners that tell us that we have to provide it, which ends up with interesting discussions at engineering approval stage when they say we don't want it. So
Okay,
we can work on that wording, I'm sure.
But the converse would also apply where you have a lesser provision and the subdivision pattern doesn't actually provide for it either.
Mm.
And it's going to be needed. So it just gets messy. You know, wouldn't it be better to get it all tidied up as soon as you can, or do you think there's just too much uncertainty in terms of council's own intentions?
I think possibly at this stage, we haven't actually consulted with council on this particular matter as to where their current intentions are. As I said, it looks like while they look like they've got to put the route, it's been in the walking plan, it was, I think that the Darfield to Westmount QE one was 2022, 23. And so it's been obviously pushed out 2 years, 3 years later, another 10 years. So I'm not sure councils staff have turned their mind to it, but we can check and find out and tidy that wording up.
Yeah, but they have signalled that it's part of their wider strategy is to provide these connections at some stage in the future.
Mm.
Well, what I guess we're looking at is if the officer's recommendation is to be agreed with, is something which is workable and something which you might not have to go back and rework in the future if things were to change.
If it comes down to it, we don't have an issue with providing the 2.5 shared path and it being a requirement if it is the ultimate decision. It's the consideration. Yeah. We could change it to provision of the shared path, taking into account the council's.
Taking into account whether it is required to align with the council's timing and preferred road.
Yes, look, Mr. Cleary has provided me with some additional wording.
Whether it is required to
With,
align with.
yeah, taking into account whether it is required to align with council's preferred route. So we can change the word provision to consideration to be given to the provision of a shared path, taking into account whether it's required to align. And so then we can get that guidance from council at the time of subdivision. And if they're requiring it, then it's provided. If not, it's just a normal footpath.
Okay. Well, through the chair, it might be worth that, getting that written up and submitted to us. But look, I don't have any other questions, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I don't necessarily have the same concern that Commissioner Dace raised, but you provide that amended wording to us. To me, the wording you've submitted merely flags to a decision maker this is a matter they should have regard to or take into account at the time the subdivision consent is being considered. All it needs to do is flag to the decision maker. They need to make a decision on that point. So I'm relaxed with either suite of wording, either what you've got currently or what you've just been discussing. But if you submit the proposed wording to us, then we can decide which, if we find in favour of the overall submission, we can decide which wording we prefer. So you'd be able to do that reasonably quickly, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. But look, apart from that, I have no further questions or clarification, but thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our rezoning hearings and in fact, the end of the proposed district plan hearings in total. We next get together, some of us, to consider variation 1 in May. So thank you very much, everyone.